I've been dressing as male for the longest time, probably since I was 4, but I actually did not know the word transgender and what it meant. So I was talking to my mom about how I hated my chest, and she told me, well, there's something called being transgender, and it's where you feel as one gender, but your body shows a different gender. And I kind of put 2 and 2 together, and then I looked up online, and I saw YouTube videos of people like talking about it, and I kind of related to them, so I was like, well, that's me. And that was around October of 7th grade.
Really amounts to is injecting pro-homosexual propaganda in the curriculum, making the schools take sides in the culture war. It's ridiculous to be using a history curriculum to try to boost students' self-esteem. The purpose of history is to teach history.
Visited a school where kids were taught that people can have more than one gender.
There's no place for that in public schools, and this is about indoctrination, not about tolerance and accommodation.
It's a pastor who wrote an article for the Christian Post where he accuses Hollywood of having a gay agenda and said that Ellen DeGeneres celebrates her lesbianism and marriage in between appearances of guests like Taylor Swift to attract young girls. The only way I'm trying to influence people is to be more kind and compassionate with one another. That is the message that I'm sending out. I don't have an agenda.
In the letter, the King's teen wrote about depression and not being accepted by her parents for her true gender identity. There's no winning, there's no way out, she wrote. But some of her last words before goodbye were, "Fix society, please."
Students at McGuffey High School encouraged each other to wear flannel shirts for what they called Anti-Gay Day.
The term authentic self has evolved into describing someone who navigates life in a genuine way and not let societal pressure dictate the way they express themselves. This term is commonly used in the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer or LGBTQ community to define those that have discovered their authentic self and live their life accordingly. This is not an easy thing to do, especially as a high school student trying to fit in. According to many studies done by the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network and the Human Rights Campaign, it has been found that LGBTQ individuals are at higher risk for mental health disorders. By including LGBTQ topics in school curricula, a voice is given to a community that has often been silenced. This act also provides a positive representation of someone like me in the classroom, and the lack of this representation and voice correlates to the higher risk of mental health disorders for LGBTQ individuals. I first got in touch with Dr. Marco Hidalgo, a psychotherapist that specializes in working with LGBTQ individuals. I needed to find out why LGBTQ individuals had higher risk for mental health disorders like stress, anxiety, and depression.
There have been a couple of studies in the last few years that have really documented that LGBTQ individuals are at higher risk for conditions like depression and anxiety, and are at higher risk for risk behaviors like suicide compared to heterosexual people. And a lot of it is considered not because they are psychologically something internal is different than heterosexual people, but they face more adversity socially. And so all of that adversity, really the cumulative aspect of that, is that it often impacts them emotionally.
With this new information, I started putting more pieces of the puzzle together, and I began to answer my own question. I understood that the higher adversity that LGBTQ students faced led to the higher risk for mental health disorders among the same population. But how could education help this issue? I knew there was an importance to having LGBTQ units in school, but I was still trying to figure out the why aspect. In order to further unravel this topic, I reached out to a man named Joshua Goodman. He is a writer for Huffington Post's Gay Voices column and is currently studying to get his PhD in psychology with a concentration in the mental health of LGBTQ individuals.
When I started my preliminary research for this project, I stumbled upon your article, 5 Reasons Schools Should Adopt LGBTQ-inclusive Sex Ed. And so I was wondering if you could kind of elaborate more on reason number 4. It can demystify the questioning process.
Having those kinds of information, I think it provides, just education on their own experience. And it's worth noting that there are millions of kids in this country, millions of youth who either identify as queer or will one day come come to identify as part of the LGBTQ community. And so we have millions of kids in schools right now who are sort of in this boat, and very little is said to speak to their experience in these classes. So at least incorporating this into sex education and certainly elsewhere in the curriculum helps to speak to their experience and helps them to make sense of their experience, much in the way that the more heteronormative approach of more traditional sex education probably helps heterosexual identifying students to make sense of their own experiences.
Creating an LGBTQ-inclusive sex ed and integrating LGBTQ topics into other core classes at school do more than educate. They start a conversation. A study done by the Center of Disease Control and Prevention found that only 22.9% of schools across the nation have a gay/straight alliance club, and only 19.2% of schools have an LGBTQ-inclusive sex ed curriculum. Although these numbers are greatly larger than they were 5 years ago, it's still not enough. Nutria senior William Kirby says that while he proudly identifies as gay, this conversation is often tiptoed around, making it uncomfortable to talk about openly.
But I just think that people feel alone and like there's no one they can really talk to about it, just because, well, one, I mean, we're at a pretty big school and I still feel like there's like almost no other gay people here. But also it's just like people, even when people seem like nice and accepting about it, it's still something, like other than my really close friends, I don't really like talking about it because it's a conversation that always feels weirdly centered around me, and like people will always look to me as to whether or not we should say something. Like I remember there was like we were at a meeting for the Safe Rights Board, and then someone mentioned how someone wanted to change the name of Turnabout, and everyone looked at me and was like, I don't want to have an opinion about how whether or not Turnabout actually is like offensive to gay people without like me talking first. And it's like, well, I would hope that people could formulate their own opinions and have conversation with me independent of like, and not be afraid to, because when everyone's talking about it, I think people are less likely to sort of be stigmatized.
And freshman Alex Singh says that by not talking about the LGBTQ community in an open way, LGBTQ individuals trying to come out are left terrified because it's not clear if they will be accepted.
Terrifying would sum it up.
Okay, do you want to elaborate?
Mainly because, like, as you're coming out, you don't know who's going to be accepting and who's not. So you're thinking about all the different aspects, as in, like, who should I come out to first? Who's going to be the most accepting? And if I come out to this person, will they help others understand the whole point? So, I mean, when you're kind of thinking about it, you take a ton of stuff into consideration. And that's probably the most terrifying part.
So if these units have the potential to be so impactful, do they belong only in the sex ed classroom? Dr. Noskin, an English teacher at Nutria High School, had some answers about why it is important to not only have these topics as part of our sex education curriculum, but to have them integrated into every class subject.
When I looked at our curriculum, there just were not a lot of voices in it. You know, as I looked around at our students, I just realized that it was important to think about where they're coming from. And I think, you know, it's important to think about race, it's important to think about ethnicity, but it's also important to think about gender. And if you're going to start thinking about gender, then I think it's important to think about sexual orientation. And the way it started out was maybe it would be good to give students a choice. And maybe at first it was just looking at various issues of diversity, so they weren't all LGBTQ. But then after thinking about it more, I thought, but why not? You know, and if one or two of the books are going to be LGBTQ books, why shouldn't they all be? And then trying to find one that was really well written and appropriate, and that's how I kind of narrowed it down to just one book that we would all read and study.
Gender and sexuality studies are becoming more and more funded in college and universities, yet these same courses are just barely being represented in high school classrooms, let alone grade school classrooms. The benefits of having LGBTQ-inclusive curriculums are far beyond benefits for only LGBTQ individuals. It becomes a learning ground for every student and socially makes the LGBTQ community more accepted, thus lowering the amount of LGBTQ individuals struggling with mental health disorders.